Thank you for being here. I'd like to talk to you about my own sort of experiences with powerlessness and lack of presence, and kind of how I learned through this experience that I had how common this is and how much we are all sort of dealing with challenges and working them out in our own ways. But I'm going to start with a sort of funny story. It might be funny to you. It was not funny to me at the moment. But how many of you have had to give an elevator pitch? All right. So Americans know this term. This is not a term, by the way, that I hear in a lot of other cultures, but it's a horrible thing, right? Elevator pitches are awful because you are supposed to summarize in like a minute everything you know, why you should be hired, what you're going to do in the future, why you're better than your competitors who you've never even seen. It's kind of awful. And so in my 5th year of grad school, and I was at Princeton, where I already felt sort of like an imposter, my advisor decided to take me to this very elite conference where the sort of the best grad students in their 5th year were taken to this conference to be shopped around for jobs. And I was dreading it. I was so nervous. Of course I wanted to go, but that doesn't mean that I wasn't dreading it at the same time. So I decided that I would really rehearse this elevator pitch. And I over-rehearsed it. I scripted it. I just rehearsed and rehearsed. I had it completely committed to memory. I get there, and I was already kind of borrowing trouble from the future. Before I even got there, I decided that it was going to go badly. And so I get there, and on the very first night, the very first event is a dinner. So I step into the elevator. It really wasn't an elevator. It's not just a metaphor. And there are 3 men in the elevator, and they are all like giants in my field, which is social psychology. Now, anyone who's been in a PhD program or has a PhD will know that the people you cite as a doctoral student, they feel like they're celebrities to you, right? They might walk out of the conference center and no one knows who they are, but to you they are these huge, giant celebrities. So I walk in and I recognize all of them instantly. None of them recognizes me, of course, except that I've got my giant name tag on. And they don't look interested, because at this conference, these people really want to be talking to each other and having a drink in the lobby bar with their friends, not listening to these awful elevator pitches from these students. So I get in, and they look at me, and they look bored, and then one of them says, almost with effortful indifference, "Okay, we're in an elevator, give us your pitch." That was now, here's this thing I've been dreading really for like 4.5 years. And this was kind of the worst case scenario, but it got even worse because I immediately went blank. And that whole going blank thing, that is a real thing that happens, because what happens when you are an animal in fight or flight mode thinking that you're going to be attacked by a tiger, suddenly remembering your elevator pitch no longer matters, right? It goes because your body is just like, get out of here, right? So it's completely gone. So the words are just like, I don't even know what I was saying. They were tumbling out of my mouth. I think I remember saying, "I study." Like, that was about it, But the thing is, I'm supposed to be talking about my research, my dissertation research that I've been doing for 4.5 years, and I can't remember anything, and I keep apologizing and restarting, and my eyes are like darting from face to face trying to get some sign of reassurance, but nothing is coming. There's some amusement on their faces. I'm even in this short elevator ride planning out plan B, and I'm going, well, I used to be like a hippie, and I could be an organic farmer, and that's totally, like, I'm thinking, it's okay, I'm not going to be a professor, it's okay. Like, I'm trying to calm myself. My mind is everywhere but there, right? It's not really there. I'm trying to figure out what they're thinking of me, but I'm not really thinking about what they're thinking or what I'm thinking. I'm completely absent from that moment. And so we get to the top, and it's funny because I wrote about this in my book, and I refer to it as the 20th floor, but my friend was reading my manuscript. She said it was the 4th floor. She was at this conference, but I remembered it as the 20th floor. So we get to the top, and this is what happens. The elevator doors open. 2 of the guys just like avert their eyes and flee quickly because it was so bad. The one that had goaded me to give the pitch does this. So here's the elevator. Okay, so he steps across the threshold, and as the doors are closing, and I'm still in the elevator. They're almost closed. He says, "That was the worst elevator pitch I have ever heard." That's what he said. And the doors closed, and I didn't even get out. So I didn't even go to the dinner. I went like into the fetal position and, back to the lobby, and that was that. And I sat there in the lobby going over it again and again. We call this post-event processing or ruminating, right? I'm dissecting it. Why didn't I do this or that? And then I'm like planning my do-over where I run up and somehow bump into them accidentally like a rom-com and do it again, right? But better this time. And you don't get to do that, right? That it's done. And you need to then be present in the next moment. But I couldn't be. So when you think about this, there's whatever is your biggest challenge is usually a situation that you approach with a sense of dread, that you execute with this anxiety and distraction, and you leave with a sense of regret because you feel like you didn't show them who you are, and you're haunted by it, wanting to have that do-over. The interesting thing is that, after giving this TED Talk a few years ago, and after that was posted, and I've gotten literally tens of thousands of messages, emails, and letters, and people coming up to me in airports, the theme is that people are talking about a big challenge, and what that challenge is varies dramatically across people. It could be relationship conflict, interviewing for a job. It might be for some, I hear from a lot of retirees, and for them, a lot of time, that's a really difficult transition where you lose your sense of identity and power. And for them, the challenge sometimes is going to see their doctor and being taken seriously, because we know this is a problem in healthcare where older people are not taken as seriously. So the challenges vary dramatically. But here's the theme that's the same. What people are talking about in these emails is not the concrete outcome, like, did I get the job? It's how did they feel when they left? Did they feel self-respecting? Did they feel respected by the other? Did they feel that they had shown them who they really are? That's what ends up mattering. And that's what I find now so interesting and relevant to this idea of presence. Presence is not about some, permanent state that you eventually reach at the end of your life if you go to enough yoga classes. And yoga is great, but I think we have this idea that presence is this grand thing up on a pedestal that only a very small percentage of us ever get to. Presence is not complicated like that. It's simple, but not easy. It's the state in which we know who we are and we're able to access that best self in these really stressful moments. And that's what allows people to leave feeling satisfied. Even if they don't get the job, they can live with the outcome as long as they feel that they represented themselves well. So I want to go back and talk a little bit about how I got to where I was and what sort of contributed to my feeling in that elevator of being a complete phony and an imposter and not really even believing the story that I was telling. When I was a sophomore in college, I went to the University of Colorado, and I was driving with friends of mine from Missoula, Montana, back to Boulder in the middle of the night. So we were trying to make that 14-hour drive, and you know what it's like out here, right? There are big open stretches of road, no cars on the highway in the middle of the night. So we're driving, and we're taking shifts. And my friend, who was the last to drive out of the three of us, fell asleep at about 4 in the morning and went off the road, hit the rumble strip, woke up, overcorrected, and flipped the car several times. We were in an old SUV without roll bars and the like. I was sleeping in the back, and I was thrown out the side windows. My friends had seatbelts on. We landed on the roof, and they actually amazingly were okay. So, I like to make that clear, because I know when you hear a story like this, you can't help but worry about the other people who were involved. And I'm not saying that it wasn't hard for them, but I was thrown out the side, and I don't remember any of this, but I woke up in a head injury rehab ward, and I had been withdrawn from college, and I was told, this over many months, because they're doing this neuropsychological testing for months after having a brain injury, for years even. And brain injury is remarkably common, so I'm sure some of you have been through this. So I wake up, and I go through all this testing, and they basically end up telling me, you're lucky you survived. you don't feel lucky at the time. You don't feel lucky that you were in this car accident, but you're not going to finish college. It's very unlikely that you will ever, regain the cognitive capacity to finish college. So you're high functioning, you're going to be fine, but find something else to do, which was just absolutely shattering to me. And it wasn't that I thought that I would ever be a Harvard professor. I had no dream to do something like that. I just thought for sure I would finish college, and I always identified with being smart, and I thought that was something that was never going to be taken away. So people fear losing physical abilities, but we forget that you also can lose yourself, right? Head injuries cause you to lose yourself, and I never thought that was something that could go away. One of the neuropsych tests that I took, it turned out, was an IQ test. I didn't know that I was taking an IQ test at the time, but when I got the feedback, I learned that my IQ had dropped by 30 points. I had an IQ test when I was younger because I was in the gifted program as a kid, and so I knew what my IQ was. And no one even explained this result to me, because the other thing that goes with head injury is that people don't see you as capable of even understanding the feedback, right? So you're treated a little bit like a child. So I got this feedback, and I was totally devastated by it, and I really felt like a different person. My friends told me that I was a different person, because when you have that kind of brain injury, what happens is that your brain, so think of your brain as an onion, and every layer is a different density. And so when you're thrown, or you're stopping very suddenly, all of those layers are moving at a different speed, and they're moving against each other. And what that means is that all of those axonal connections among the layers are being torn. They're breaking. And so your injury is diffuse. It's happening everywhere in the brain. The way you think is different. The way you feel is different. The way you behave is different. But you can't get that old self back again. And a lot of people with brain injuries try to get that old self back again. So they spend a lot of time trying to be who they were, but you have to kind of reconstruct who you were. And for me, it felt like holding a ball of wet sand in my hands as it was drying, and the sand is like slipping through my fingers. Like, I could not hold on to who I used to be. And I'm just gonna set this down. I think it's a little bit like, letting go of that old self, for me at least, was a little bit like when you're in a relationship that's not great and not terrible, but you're not going to get married. And you need to break it off, but you don't know what the other options are. For me, I had to sort of let go of the old self before I knew what else was out there. I didn't know what the new self would be. So that was, I think, for me, maybe the most important part of beginning to recover, was to say, I'm not that person anymore. I'm not completely different, but I can't ever reconstruct that. I've got to take this leap of faith that I'm going to become somebody else. But that becoming the new self took a long time. I mean, I don't think you're ever finished, but it took a long, long time. And a lot of that time for me was spent trying to finish college, which took me 4 extra years. I started twice and had to drop out because I was failing out of classes. I couldn't think, I couldn't process spoken information. It was a disaster. I finally finished, and miraculously, and by the time I finished, I was studying like crazy. I had to study circles around people to get by. I was accepted into a grad program at Princeton, which seemed like the biggest mistake in the world. I thought for sure this was a mistake, and they were going to find out that I was a fraud at any moment. And that's pretty much how I went through grad school, feeling like at any moment I might be found out. So in my first year, I was supposed to give a talk at the end of that year about my research to 20 people. Nothing big, right? 20-minute talk to 20 people. I was so terrified that giving this talk would reveal who I was that I told my advisor, after all of these years of getting back into college, and now I'm at Princeton, that I was going to drop out because I thought it was my best interest to not have to give this talk, for that one reason. She said, no way, you're not going to drop out. You're going to give the talk, but you might have to trick yourself into feeling safe enough to give it. Right? You know your stuff. This is not about not knowing what you're talking about. It's about your fear of sharing who you are. So she said, you're going to have to trick yourself
into giving it, and it's going to get easier every time. She said, you're going to have to fake it. And eventually, you're going to look back and say, wow, I'm doing this now. So that's sort of what happened. She actually also said, and I think this is generally good advice if you're afraid of public speaking, give every talk you are asked to give. Even if it's to the Master Gardeners Club or the Girl Scouts, like give the talk, because all of that experience is helping you with every new audience. So I got through grad school. I had this elevator pitch experience. Like, I still was feeling like a fraud. I ended up teaching for several years at different schools, and then I ended up at Harvard, which again, seemed pretty strange, but I was no longer having that acute feeling of being an imposter. And so I'm teaching in my first semester there, and 50% of the grade that you get as an MBA student at Harvard Business School is based on your participation in class. And this is a smart group of people, right? 90 students who all were smart enough to get in, and they're all competing for airtime. And they're pretty competitive. This is a pretty alpha group of people. If you don't participate, you fail. That's pretty much all there is to it. And so by the end of the first semester, I've got some students who still have not spoken in class, and I need them to speak. I have to fail them if I don't. So I wrote to them, it was like a handful, and said, I really need you. We got 2 classes left, you have to speak. One of them said, can I meet with you? And I honestly thought that she was going to come in and make an excuse about, why she hadn't spoken, and I was going to have to deal with this excuse. That wasn't what she did. What she came in and said to me was, I'm not supposed to be here. I feel like I was an admissions mistake. I came from this really rural area. I don't fit in with these people. I'm sure, I'm going to be kicked out. And it was exactly the song that I had been playing to myself over and over again for all of these years. For me, it was that I had had this head injury, and if people found out about the IQ test, I would be kicked out. I also grew up in a very rural area. There were so many reasons why I felt like a fraud. And let me just say here, there are so many reasons why we all feel like frauds at different times, right? We all have reasons, like we think it's because of this or that. Let me just say it's an incredibly common experience. And those reasons are kind of justifications that we use to explain why we feel that way. But she said, she basically collapsed. Her body language collapsed. I remember thinking that she looked like one of those wooden push-up dolls where you press the bottom, they've got elastic in them, and when you press the bottom, they collapse. And when you let go of the pressure, they pop back up again. When she came in and said that to me, I just saw her as one of those wooden dolls, totally collapsed. And I heard her say these words and thought, I know she belongs here because I've been through this, and I know that she can get through this. And we talked for a long time, and I told her, you need to fake it. I basically told her the same pep talk that my advisor had told me. You're going to fake it in class. You're going to give a comment. It's going to be fine. You're going to get through it, even if you feel nauseous. So the next day, she did that, and she actually gave an amazing comment, and heads spun because people hadn't even noticed her before. And here she is, all of a sudden being very smart. And over the years, she stayed in touch with me. And what she said to me was that she feels that she's become herself, that the faking it for her wasn't really about faking out other people. It really was about tricking herself into being herself. And so she said she had to get out of the way of herself so that she could be herself. That when she was being quiet in class, it wasn't because that's just her personality. It's because she was so afraid that if she revealed who she was, she would be found out. So for her, it really was not faking it till she made it, but faking it until she became it. And that's part of how that idea came to me, doing all of this research and hearing from people. But I want to talk a little bit more about this body language piece, how it relates to my story, and how it relates to so many people's stories of powerlessness. When I got out of the hospital, the first time I got in a car, and I was a passenger in the car, so I was very afraid to be a passenger in a car. And I remember the first time I got in a car, I immediately pulled my knees to my chest, wrapped my arms around my knees into a fetal position. And it reminded me of when I was a little kid, We lived in eastern Washington State when I was little, in a park. My dad was a park ranger, and there were no kids. We lived in a town that now has 200 people on the Columbia River, and so I really had no one to play with. So I was always outside trying to find little animals and critters and bugs. And so I would try to make these bugs into my friends. I'd build little houses for them and things. So one of the bugs that I love to play with, I call them pill bugs. I know people call them different things, but they roll up into a little ball. And they're like tiny armadillos. And I would pick them up, and every time, and I love animals, and I never wanted to hurt any animal. I didn't want to kill a mosquito, or step on an ant. If I did, I would cry as a little kid. So I would pick them up and think they would trust me because I'm good, right? I'm good-natured. They didn't trust me, right? They would immediately go into that little ball. And every time I pick them up, I think, this time I'm gonna be friends with this little pill bug. And what I finally realized was I'm this giant. To them, I'm a huge super predator who's gonna kill them. And of course they're going into this tiny ball. So when I got into that car after the car accident, I realized that I was doing the exact same thing. That's what it reminded me of, was a pill bug. And this student of mine, whose name is Katrina, when she collapsed like that, it was the same kind of thing, right? That powerlessness was making her tiny and small and want to be invisible. And so all of these things together. Now, I wish I had understood it when I was 19 and getting into that car. I did not understand then that if I had changed my body language, it would have changed the way I felt and helped me feel more powerful, and probably would have helped me recover more quickly. But I eventually ended up, and this is not an academic talk, and I won't go into the details, but studying this relationship between posture and power and how we feel and how it allows us to be ourselves and be present. And just as smiling is a universal expression of happiness, expanding your body is a universal expression of power. So think about what you do when you cross the finish line in first place. Just show me, what would you do if you crossed the finish line in first place? Exactly. That's what everyone does. And in fact, it's not just what you do. Everywhere in the world in which this has been studied, and it's now been studied in about 36 cultures, that is what people do when they win first place. 5 continents, including cultures where the researcher has had to hike in and they've never interacted with outsiders. That's what they do when they win first place. Even congenitally blind people do that when they win first place. When we feel powerful, we expand. But here's the interesting thing that we know about facial expressions like smiling. Smiling doesn't just express happiness, it also causes happiness. We call this facial feedback. So if you smile when you're feeling bad, it tends to make you feel better. It turns out the same is true with posture. If you expand when you're feeling powerless, if you fight the urge to be that frightened animal, you feel more powerful. You let your guard down. You become more approach-oriented. You see challenging opportunities as challenging situations, not as threats, but as opportunities. You become generally more positive, more confident, more optimistic about yourself and others. Your whole mindset changes. So we've done many, many studies. Other people have done many studies now showing that this is what happens. If you just stand like this for a minute or two, it changes the way you feel. You feel more powerful. Your testosterone increases. Your cortisol goes down. You think more clearly. Your abstract thinking, it goes on and on and on. And so that is, that idea that our body can lead our minds became central to how I carried myself in my own life. That, here's the thing, can you raise your hand if you remember, if this name is familiar to you? Stuart Smalley. Okay. Some of you. Sometimes I talk to groups that are like 25 and under and no one knows what I'm talking about. So let me just briefly remind you of who Stuart Smalley is. Stuart Smalley was a character on Saturday Night Live who was played by Al Franken. And Stuart Smalley, it was called Daily Affirmation with Stuart Smalley. He would look into a mirror and he would say, and if you remember this, you can say it with me. He'd say, I'm good enough, I'm smart enough, and doggone it, people like me. And the idea was that if he said this enough times, he would self-affirm and feel better about himself. Now, the joke in these sketches was that by the end, he would be wrapping himself up and rocking and saying, I am in a shame spiral, I am homeless and penniless, and I will die unloved, and I'm a total failure, and it would go on and on. I'm a fraud, I'm gonna be found out, all of these things. The reason that was funny was because we know that when we are in an acute state of anxiety and self-doubt, the worst thing we can do is say, I'm actually great. Because now we're liars too, right? We feel even worse. Now we're like, well, no, you're not confident or secure, but you're also now a liar as well. It does not work that way, which is, by the way, let me say, this whole keep calm meme does not work well, okay? It doesn't. Here's what does work well. Good research on this too. If you're feeling really anxious, say as stage fright, instead of telling yourself, I'm calm, I'm gonna calm down, say, I am excited. Because what happens is that you cannot downshift a high arousal emotion when you're in that state, but you can change the valence of it from negative to positive. So if you say to yourself, it's not anxiety, it's excitement, it totally changes the outcome. People perform dramatically better when they reframe as excitement. So that's another really small tweak in how we can kind of change the way that we feel. But so I started studying all of this powerful posture and finding that it had this huge effect on people. And when I shared that information in the TED Talk, I got all of these emails, as I said, and the stories range dramatically. And I want to share some of them with you because I think that it gives us some sort of insight into how we can use it in our own lives, but also I think how we can use this in other people's lives, people who really, really feel totally powerless. So I hope you won't mind. I'm going to do a little bit of reading briefly. Let me start with a story that I heard very recently. Someone came up to me after a conference and said, I want to tell you about how you helped me get my dad back. And it was a man in his mid-50s, and of course I didn't know where he was going with that, but he said, my father has Alzheimer's. And when I saw your talk a few years ago, I realized that he had lost his sense of pride. And so he said, he is my idol. And he's always been this powerful, strong, calm, loving person. And he was a World War II veteran, and I really, really looked up to him. When he developed Alzheimer's, his body language started to collapse. He lost his sense of power and pride. So I saw your talk and I thought, I'm gonna get him to power pose. So he said, every morning for 5 minutes, we stand like this facing each other. We always look right into each other's eyes. He doesn't know why I'm having him do this, but he's willing to do this with me every morning. And for 5 minutes, I get my father back. He said he's clear, he's strong, he's powerful. I see this sense of pride on his face again. And so I know that even if this doesn't last forever, I'm gonna have these few minutes in the morning. So again, back to these challenges, they vary dramatically across people, and the ways in which we can use this, I think, vary so much. Okay, I'm gonna just read a couple of quick stories. This one was from a man named Mac, who lives in California, and he wrote me this. He said, I've been homeless since September 2012. It isn't a very interesting story, so I won't go into it, but what I will tell you is that power posing has helped me immensely. No, I didn't turn everything around and get a high-powered job, but I am able to face the myriad, difficult, and often frightening problems I face as a homeless person, in part because while at the warming shelter last winter, I watched your TED Talk on a tablet I had at the time. Before then, I often dealt with intense shame, feelings of marginalization. My lifelong issues of depression and anxiety were hardly helped by becoming homeless either. I was often quite visibly homeless, filthy, unkempt, and I believe I just gave off that air of being homeless. Right now, even though I'll go to sleep on a piece of cardboard tonight, you would never pick me out as homeless. In fact, other homeless people who see me on the street often hit me up for money, to which I reply with a smile, I'm out here too. I give quite a bit of credit to the fact that I consciously adopted powerful posture and maximizing my space and stopping myself when I do the opposite. I don't mean to ramble on, but I was watching something else where you talk about hearing from a violinist and some others and guessed that you had never heard from a homeless person before. Well, at least in this case, it works for us too. So Mac, it turns out, I kept in touch with. Mac now has a job working with adults with developmental disabilities, and he's teaching these same things to them. So, he said it was a slow, painful process, but getting that sense of pride back was so important to my development. Now, one other thing I want to say about this is that there's a big gender difference in how people carry themselves. And women are much more likely to carry themselves in contractive postures, to move in contractive ways. Men are more expansive. I wondered, do we learn this? Is this something that's innate? And it occurred to me that it's not innate when I noticed this happen. My son is 13. When he hit middle school, I noticed that his female friends who had freely run around with their arms in the air, doing cartwheels, not worrying about their body language, they got to middle school and suddenly they're pulling their sleeves down over their hands, wrapping themselves up, making themselves small, covering their faces, playing with their hair. All of a sudden they were adopting this really powerless body language. And the boys were not doing that. They do start slouching, but they're not doing that contractive stuff that I saw girls doing. So we did this study with little kids, 4-year-olds and 6-year-olds, where we had them look at pictures of the wooden dolls in collapsed or expansive postures. They looked at 16 pairs of these photos. And all we asked them was this: which one is the boy, which one is the girl? And this is what we found. By age 4, 75% thought the expansive ones were boys and the contractive ones were the girls. By age 6, 85% thought that. But the more alarming finding was that at age 4, out of the 16 pictures, so if a perfect score is seen, all 16 contractive ones as girls. At age 4, 13% of the kids get a perfect score. By age 6, that's half of them. So they are learning this association. They're learning that girls contract, that they are supposed to be dainty and delicate, and that is what femininity is. And I think we need to untether this idea that femininity is contractive, because what happens is that girls don't just learn that they should take up less space physically, they learn that they should take up less space in the world, right? That they should share their ideas less, that they should speak less, that they're not as good at things, that they should be quiet even when they should be standing up for themselves. So I want to leave you with this last story from a woman who came up to me after a conference as well and said, she was waiting for me for a long time, and I saw that her friends were kind of comforting her, and I could tell that she had something very serious to tell me. And she said, I want to tell you about how your talk affected me and how I used it. She said, when I was 30, I got divorced. I was really young when I got married, and it was a really bad situation. And so I moved to Central America with some friends. I decided I needed to restart. And I got a job as a waitress in a local cafe. And pretty quickly after I started, my boss started sexually harassing me. And it became every day, all the time. All the time he was making comments about my body. And it was very uncomfortable, and I felt myself getting more and more powerless. But I started to think, maybe it's not so bad, maybe it's not really, all of the things that happen when people are going through this kind of thing. She's having all of the self-doubt. Do I really deserve to do anything about this? Am I making too big a deal of this? After a couple of months, she said one day he just stopped calling me by my name and started calling me by a very crude term. And that's how he would yell across the restaurant to her using this crude term. And she said, I knew that I had to quit. And my first instinct was to run. And I talked to my friends about it, and they kind of reminded me of who I am. And she said, and I'm not a person who doesn't protect the people who comes after her. And I thought, I can't just leave without explaining to him why I'm leaving. But by this point, I felt so powerless and so terrified that it was hard to imagine doing that. So she said, at some point, somebody sent me your talk. And I thought, I need to do this. I need to do this to get my old self back again. And so she said, one morning before a staff meeting, I knew that was going to be the day. So she said, I stood in my house, and they were living in this open-air tree house on stilts, which I kind of love the image of this. And she said, I stood in this tree house like Wonder Woman. She said, I stood there for a long time because I wanted to make it stick. And she said, I played my favorite song, and I dressed up in a way that made me feel good about myself. And she said, I walked into town to the cafe, and as I was walking, she said, I felt myself getting bigger and opening up again. And by the time I got there and I looked at my boss, I looked at him, and I thought, my first thought was, you're not as big as I thought you were, which I thought was interesting. And she said, and then I felt myself taking my power back from him. She said, I wasn't taking his power, I was taking mine back. But the other thing that happened, she said, was that I felt this incredible, overwhelming sense of generosity. She said, I felt strong and generous. And so I said to him, I'm quitting, and I think you know why I'm quitting. And he immediately fessed up and apologized. And she said, I want you to be a better person. You have daughters, and I know that you would never want them to be talked to this way. I don't want to hurt you. I don't want to ruin your business or ruin your life or your reputation. I want you to be a better person. And I want you to find it in yourself to be that better person. And so she's having this conversation with him, and she said, I wish I had had a recorder, because it wasn't me, it was a divine voice. And I said, it was exactly you. That divine voice is the best you. When you feel powerful in that way, that personal power and that pride, you get to be exactly who you are. And you are powerful and you are generous, and that is what happened. You know, that is divinity. And she said, now when she walks into challenging situations, it's not like everything's easy all the time, but she can remember that she did that. And so every time it gets a little bit easier for her to feel powerful again. Every time she realizes that she's bigger than the situation. And so I want to leave you with this, and I think we're going to have a little discussion too, but from Maya Angelou, who overcame enormous challenges and was so wise, and once said, stand up straight and realize who you are, that you tower over your circumstances. So I'll leave you with that. Thank you so much, and I think we're going to chat now.
Thank you so much, Amy.
Thank you.
Okay, we've got a couple questions for you.
Sit here. Sure. Is this okay? All right.
So the first question came in, and I can understand what she's saying. She said, Amy, I turn red when talking in public. I think I actually stop breathing. I know I do it, but have been unable to overcome in 40 years. Yeah. Help.
Okay. All right. I feel like a dear Abby now. Here we go. So here's the trick about this. When we feel like frightened animals, we do kind of two things physically. We wrap up and make ourselves small, and we start breathing really shallowly and quickly. And it does not serve us. It might serve us if we're being chased by a tiger, but it doesn't when we're just going into a job interview, right? So we have not evolved past this response that's really not meant for social situations. The trick is that the breathing is the reason you breathe like that is that it's sending a cue to the vagus nerve that you are in a fight or flight situation. So what you need to do is not focus on things to help you feel better. What you need to do is focus on your breathing, right? So you need to stop. You need to pause. Pauses are powerful. So keep in mind that when you're speaking, you know, pausing is not losing power. When you pause, that's what happens, right? When you pause, everyone falls silent and you have their attention again. So pause, collect yourself, and start to breathe deeply. You must force yourself to do that, because that then sends the signal to the vagus nerve that you're in what we call the rest and digest state, which basically means you are safe. And that will feed back and make it so much easier for you to feel comfortable. So I would say, focus on your breathing. Focus before you go on so that you optimize your brain before you even go into that situation. And when you feel yourself doing that, slow down, put your hand on something, stretch out, don't collapse your shoulders because that's going to make it harder to breathe deeply, and focus on your breathing.
Thank you. Someone else said, would you please walk into the room and show us how you would enter a room with your posture and your stride when you're going for an interview?
Ah, okay. So I will do that, but you'll have to be the interviewer.
Okay.
Let me just say, I don't think there's one way, and there are some things not to do, like the super aggressive firm handshake of the 80s that I think went with like suits with shoulder pads. I don't think it's a great idea for anybody. I think that what you want to communicate is confidence without arrogance, right? You want to be confident, but also show that you're interested and engaged and you want to be there, right? You're interested in the other person. So I think that you want to walk in. It's kind of hard for me to do it in an artificial way, but can you stand up? And first of all, hey, if you are the interviewer, come out from behind your desk, because when you stay behind your desk and you're adopting powerful posture, it causes the other person to collapse, to complement your body language, and that shuts them down, and you don't want that to happen. So if I were walking in, I think I would walk straight in and say, it's so nice to meet you, right? So you lean forward, right? You're right there, you're looking in the person's eyes, but it's not the nice to meet you, right? I'm gonna reach out first. If the person keeps their hand down and isn't going to shake your hand, don't force them to, right? There are also big cultural differences in how to do these things. So for example, a lot of my students are doing work internationally, and one of the mistakes they make is they go to an East Asian culture using Western body language, which does not work well, right? That is not a place where you go in and you reach out and you immediately shake somebody's hand. There, confidence is expressed in a much more subtle way and much more along the vertical axis. So how high or low do you bow? Do you raise your glass during a toast? Do you sit or do you stand? There you really need to be paying attention to what the other person is doing and responding in kind. But the idea, keep in mind, is keep your shoulders open. Don't stand with your feet crossed like this. I see women do this all the time, and I feel like I could just push them over so easily, right? Be grounded, but don't go in like this either. I now have to tell people, power pose before you go in, because I got some emails after the talk from people saying, well, I did the Wonder Woman in the job interview and it didn't go well. And I'm like, oh, that is not what I meant at all. So don't do that. Anyway, but yeah, confident and engaged, but also pay attention to what they're doing.
Thank you, Amy.
Okay.
Someone said, how do we ensure our young daughters keep their power in an environment that suppresses it? For example, schools, organized sports, etc.
Yeah. So as I alluded to, this is something that I'm really interested in right now. And I do see girls losing power around that age. So one thing is start early. Right, so I think that we need to teach our kids in general that this body-mind connection, first of all, it's not a fringe idea. This is mainstream science, right? This is real, a real thing that's happening. And in fact, by harnessing it, it gives you enormous power. So I think we teach kids that the body is this thing that you do in something that you work with in phys ed, and that's it. And the rest of the time you're in your head. So I think teaching about the body-mind connection earlier is so important throughout the day. So there are even studies showing that kids who are taught to sit in more expansive postures in grade school are much more productive and perform better at on all kinds of cognitive tasks. So posture is really affecting us. I think we need to teach kids that they should sit up straight, not to respect others, but to respect themselves. And I think that's true for boys and for girls. For girls, I think we need to show them images of women who carry themselves unapologetically with pride and poise, like Misty Copeland. Could you raise your hand if you know who Misty Copeland is? This is amazing, right? So I used to be a professional ballet dancer and no one knew who any ballet dancers were. Misty Copeland is the first African-American woman to be promoted to principal dancer at American Ballet Theater, and she overcame enormous challenges. She grew up in California, amazing dancer. When she basically went through puberty and developed muscles and breasts and a body, she was told that she was no longer built for ballet. And now look up Misty Copeland and tell me that she's not built for ballet. She's amazing. She was told she was too muscular and too athletic, which is crazy because it's an incredibly athletic thing. But she kept quitting, getting back into it, quitting, and she finally realized that she had this opportunity to be a real role model to to all little girls. I mean, to teach them that you don't have to be a toothpick. You are allowed to grow up and become an adult and be powerful and proud of that body. And she now, she's just a huge inspiration to so many. And, she shows off her muscles. She is so feminine. I think she shows girls that you can be so feminine and still expansive and powerful at the same time. So we need to be showing them more of that.
Thank you, Amy. And we have one more question. When you had your brain injury, was there a specific method that you used to heal? And what do you do when you feel like giving up?
Whew, that's tough. It's funny, we were talking about this on the ride over about when you're recovering from different kinds of injuries and illnesses, and you want to have this wisdom that here's the answer, but I think everyone's path is so different. I think for me, what I was explaining about letting go of the old self, that is so important. So if it is brain injury, you have to let go of that. You have to be okay with sort of relearning to learn, relearning who you are, figuring out, just sort of having the faith that you're going to work it out. The other thing is that it is a slow process. And if you think it's going to happen overnight, you want to quit every day. That's the problem. So and this is a little bit of an American thing. We tend to set up goals like New Year's resolutions, and I hate New Year's resolutions. There's a reason why by January 15th, everyone's given up on them, because they're way too big, they're way too distant, and there are a million steps to getting to them. So every time we misstep or fail, we want to quit. And it's the same thing with recovery. We have this image of where we want to be, but we don't know how we're going to get there. What we need to do is really celebrate the tiny little victories and be happy with that incremental change, and have faith that over time, in aggregate, you get there. You eventually get there.
Great. Thank you so much, Amy. We have been so excited about having you come to Women's Week. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for being here.
Thank you very much.
Really appreciate it. Thank you so much.